Hi, I'm Seamless, and today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. So this is how to chord, and specifically how to chord 2. Oh my god. Anyway, there's a couple things I want to test about this particular sound. So, and a lot of times when I talk about what's the good, like make a good supersaw, chord stack and whatever, the typical advice is just layering. In particular, to do voice layering, where every note in your voice stack, so like this note is different from this note, is different from this note, and that they're literally all different instances of whatever thing you're making. That's a lot of work, and it also sounds really good. But on top of that, you can also do note tracking on your parameters, where main things like how deep your unison is different based on what note you're playing. And if you do that to enough parameters, it's basically as if you had done that per note layering kind of thing. And if you do that to enough parameters in something like Harmor, it's probably going to be cooler. In this case, I've note tracked quite a lot. I've note tracked the unison in here, but there's also something going on after the fact here that's actually contributing quite a bit. So this is what this is the whole thing, right? It's this, some saturation, and some compression. And let's listen to what it sounds like just the Harmor by itself. When it's not clipping. So the idea here is this turn to this, and that wasn't just a bit of compression doing that. It was also mid-side saturation. It began as mid-side saturation, but really what it is just mid-saturation with leaving the side alone. The way that I did this in here is I use this stereo shaper, and you create this form of your levels here, and this creates phase cancellation in the left and right speakers that result out of the main output a mid signal. Mid-side is essentially a description of the information in your speakers. A stereo signal is just information going on in two speakers. A mono signal is something that's evenly in both speakers at once. So a mid-side split is a signal. You take a signal, and then you take the bits of it that are only shared between the two bits, and then that's mono. And then you take the stuff that's completely independent on both speakers, and that's the side. You can do this with phase cancellation with a plugin like this. And here you also set out the in-out difference. And basically it says, okay, what got canceled is what goes out the other out. So it's the side. You create an extra output. But come in here, output audio, add one, doop. And then there it is. And this idea here is that the mid is the thing that I was distorting. And I distorted it with some pretty light saturation, but because these are high frequency chord stuff, it's a pretty big impact on things. That's actually, yeah, it's okay. So here's what just the mid sounds like. And I high passed the crap out of it because the idea here is on top of doing that the phase splitting to get the mid-side stuff, I'm also doing a phase split on the distortion. Here's the thing here, and this is just flipping phase. It's not doing craziness in its own self. It's just altering the phase of this signal, specifically so that when a phase cancels against the unflipped distorted signal, we equal out to something that's just the distortion out on top of what would be also just the dry. So here's just the dry. Play like 5 times. And then here's just the distortion with that high frequency bit. And by their powers combined. And a regular distorted signal still has the dry signal in it, because what distortion does is that it adds higher frequency information on the stuff. So if you do all that phase canceling right, you can get it so that just the high frequency addition is what's coming out of that other end there. And then you can EQ and separate things just like that and not have to worry about trying to EQ the entire signal after the fact. And then over here is the side. Isn't that weird? Even weirder is we can't actually see what it does. But we can still hear it, and this EQ still does stuff, so it can still work out. And this is just mid-side EQ. It's slightly more complicated than a lot of the plugins make it, but it works, does the job. And the idea here is we can control like how loud stereo is in certain bits, but also like remove stereo from parts that don't need it, like in the extremely low end. And that kind of thing. But let's talk about the extremely low end. Why is there extremely low end in this sound? And that's because I wanted, as an experiment, to see if I can make a chord stack like this that was its own bass. And you could do that in a patcher or something like a layering experience pretty easily, because you could just like separate subs and have the sub, and then that's just the end of it. And normally that's what you would do. You'd have a lower separate instrument that's basically your bass. But the thought I wanted to have is, with enough note tracking, can I make a low note be a viable bass with the high voices still doing the job that a supersaw should? So the idea is that now we have to care about the settings of what things mess with pitch, and try to not have them do that on the low end. So what are all the things that mess with pitch in the way that I have here? And most of that is unison. And you can see actually in the regular unison window, that's Prism 2, that it kind of rolls off on the low end here. And I do have 5 voices, and it's still phase spread. And you might think, okay, well, that's still gonna screw with the like coherence of the low end, and you're right about that, but it won't move. It'll be at a level, it'll be at a reduced level, because you add different phases of sine waves together, whatever, but the output is still gonna be a low regular tone. And that's what we want. So the whole thought here is I'm basically doing all the kind of layering work that you would do, but with key tracking stuff and inside Harmor. And then I wanted to see if I could corral it correctly to get it to equal out to being a smooth low end that's like reliable, that you could play in a song and it'll work out. And part of this high pass distortion stuff is part of that, so that like the bass that's in the low end is just not ever touched by something bad. And even Maximus, I'm doing, OTT style stuff, but I'm not crushing it on the master either. I'm only crushing it on the low bands, and then I'm just turning it down so that it doesn't clip. And this is because a sound like this, you're gonna mix it onto stuff, so you need to have the motion and the movement it has without ruining it too much with too much compression. Yeah, so let's talk about all this stuff in here. So there's 2 parts, and here's what they sound like separately. Let's actually not play it through here. What I find interesting about that particular high frequency layer is that by itself it sounds really like thin and stupid, but it has an impact on the layer of the other part that doesn't really sound like what it should do, right? It kind of hides in there. You don't even hear that high frequency knocking ring that we hear when it's by itself, but its impact is changing enough of it to make it do the thing that we need to do. And how do we control any of that? Well, the other thing I've key tracked is which voices are or are not the saw or square series. You control this in the timbre window up here. By default, Harmor presents you with the square or saw alternatively, and all that really is just a description of a series that, like, these have all the harmonics and these have every other harmonic. There could be other shapes you could do. If you changed phase, it would literally change the shape of the waveform, but it would still have the series that's involved. And that kind of like thin, woody, weird thing to say, sound on top of that, because I'm from the 90s, that's a square phenomenon. Like, this is predominantly square. And like this has some square going on there too, but when they layer together, the harmonics intertwine in such a way that it kind of puts some things into a saw perspective, even though they're different notes. Isn't that fun? On top of that, I'm also doing stuff like, I think on the other one, yeah. So this one has a different timbre keyboard mapping, and like this is the depth to which I refer to about like keyboard tracking your parameters. If you want to have the same result as if you had layered individual entire patches onto individual notes in your stack. So you got to make big differences. In this one, I'm also doing this one here and this one here, just slightly different. The EQ is different. On the B here, I've just flat out prevented it from creating low enough frequencies on things. And this is the global EQ. So when you play a note, it shows you where the low end of that particular note is going to begin. And like, that's still kind of low, all things considered. But actual bass notes, we're going to have that lowest harmonic removed so that there's not going to be competition with the one going on the other side. You can even see that down here, like those harmonics, like the square harmonics are predominant, but there are still the saw harmonics there, and that's why we get a little bit of that like bite in the low end. Everything has a point and it matters. Oh yeah, so I'm using Prism also, and they're on different values, but I also changed the shape. And it's a subtle difference, and the shape itself was pretty arbitrary. It's just the idea that like between the sides, you want to have differences in them so that they play together. And the playing is what makes a super saw sound cool. It's everything. It's all of it. One of the reasons why I like using Harmor so much is because it's all about this kind of phase collision, which is what makes a super saw a super saw. Yep, unison pitch thickness, Prism changes. I have a tiny pluck on the filter. The filter it's a really tiny pluck. And in this song, the sound is designed beyond all the way up, but I do also have this So there's this tiny little kind of on the end of it. On top of that, there's also a pluck on the volume where like it's on and then there's a little bit of release so that there's actually some release. Normally I would have a note end when it needed to end, but I did something special with the reverb inside Harmor. So there's reverb on here and you can kind of hear it when the note ends. It's being compressed up hard enough for it to be audible, but the weirdness about it inside Harmor is that I am using this effects fader thing up here. Now this is a whole bunch of weirdness, but really what it is like the distortion mixing here is that it has an opportunity to mix the thing in there with different phases and whatnot, and it has a dry wet and then phase change mix with the dry and the wet, and all the way up here is all the way dry, and in the articulator I'm having it come down after the note ends. And what that's telling it to do is to come all the way down to midpoint here where the effects are just back on again. And this is a lot like a pretty typical approach where you are animating a reverb not to be on while the note's playing, but to be on while the note's off. And this is just happening internally inside Harmor with the direct FX control in here. And given that we went pretty light touch with like the effect of the reverb, the whole point of the mid-side split is that any kind of delicateness in the side can be untouched by whatever majorness you're doing to the mid. And that's why we're able to have a pretty smooth, like, big air sound, even though we also have a harsh, like, direct tone. And it's because of all this splitting. Splits. Do the splits. What else is important? Okay, in Advanced tab, I have ramping all the way down and the granulizing all the way down. And the granular like depth of your automation determines how resolute these curves are and what resolution they are, that kind of thing. I don't think I'm doing anything too intense though that actually requires that, but I just kind of put that up there for safety's sake. When I make this stuff, I usually begin on like, I make a point A and then come over here and there's a copy part and then paste part. And then I start making the changes. It wasn't so much that I just built these two things and that was that. This one's also a higher octave, which is also pretty typical of layering in an individual sound, like if you're doing a lead sound or something, like playing octaves on top of each other is a pretty decent strat. And you can also do things like push the pitch-based effects higher, like detunes and phase cancellation and whatever, that kind of thing, because it happens faster with the faster stuff, so we don't hear the mud as easily. Yeah. So as far as actually distorting going, what happens in here, we just did all that kind of split stuff, but it's really important that there's an EQ before and after the distortion. But in order for this to work, in order for like this to add up to what would be the distortion, but just individually controlled for phase and all its stages, you have to add up phases. The latency has to be a deal. Actually, we can straight up see latency. And also labels. Okay, that's weird. But if we could see the latency, we would see that there wouldn't be any here because I turned off the high quality mode here. High quality mode introduces anti-aliasing, which requires it to do a thing, so it takes a second. But without it on, it's just straight value changes, and it isn't. So that's why there could be two EQs. Oh, look at that. That's why there could be an EQ. There we go. There could be an EQ before and after, and only one EQ in the other chain, and still have it add up to be the right togetherness and phase stuff for it to do the thing. The idea being that before we do anything, if we did nothing at all, it should sound like the unchanged original signal and not like some sort of phase brokenness because we didn't do it right. Yeah, so that's the sort of the idea. And then I high passed before the distortion. That's also part of the idea because, again, this was about the thing having its own bass. And a lot of the times when you look at a supersaw big stack kind of thing, you're thinking, okay, I want to have a bass. It's definitely a separate process kind of thing, which means that you don't really want that lower bit to impact on the higher bit. And when you distort things and you have a low end in there, like this lower bit frequency, like I was already turning it down, but if I turned it way the fuck up, you start to hear the low frequency tone on the high frequency stuff, at least in the mid side. The mid side, I meant literally the side that was the mid. That doesn't make any sense, but I meant the mid bit. Anyway, the idea being, without the high frequency, or rather the low frequency interference, the high frequency tones are multiplying now from higher frequency. And it's going to be a faster and smoother tone. Like if you want to have distortion that sounds smooth, it's a high frequency thing. It's high frequency distortion and not so much representative in the low frequency in the beginning. And you just do that by just controlling what goes into the distortion. And then this is super low. It's also turned down a lot because the original signal is not nearly as loud as that is now. And on top of being able to control it all together, we could just make it less or more because we have that control about it. and then the completely unaltered, well, undistorted side and mid. Because when you're distorting something, adding high frequency information, which means that the thing about it that you're going to like is going to be its effect on the high frequencies. And that means that also that the low frequencies of the original sound are going to be the thing that's just correct. But there's also like low frequency stuff that shows up in distortion all the time, and it's not always great. So this is a big way to just avoid all of it. Now, compression wise, the whole thought here was like just thinking how I would end up wanting to mix this in the track. And there's definitely dynamics changes, and especially in service to bass, I wanted the bass to be represented. So constantly that. And then it's all just about different speeds that are kind of light. So you could actually see the line moving around, which is pretty rare for a thing that I'm compressing, because normally you'd see it happening fast enough that it just looks like a white wall and it'll basically distort. But we already did all that tonality. So for once, the goal of the compression here is not to actually make it better, but to just arrange the way that it's already good to be good. And I already did all that work beforehand. Yeah. Cool. So moral of the story, no track your supersaws. And also mid-side distortion. Mid-side split distortion, phase split. Split your phases. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that fun stuff. And as usual, have a nice day. Also, check out my Discord if you want.